Okay, so this week we move to the fourth question of our series, which was spurred again from the question that pulled from last year's question that we had to face of what would you do if St. Anne's went away? And this year, the question is, what would Fremont do if St. Anne's went away? Not, again, to make us think of worrying about whether or not we will survive, but to get us to think not only what it means, what St. Anne's purpose is for us, but also for the wider community. So the questions we've been asking are, what was the first week's question? You want to remember?
What makes us brings us joy?
Yes. What is a calling? How do you find it? And what is a calling? Terry, what you just said.
What brings us joy?
What brings us joy? What makes us come fully alive? Thurman's quote was, don't ask what the world needs, ask what makes you come alive and go do it. Because what the world needs are people who are fully alive. And so we explored what makes us come fully alive as individuals. And that was a really generative discussion, and I remember people finding commonalities across the board with this discussion. In the second week, what was our question? It's okay. What is St. Anne's calling as a parish? Having looked at what a calling means to us as individuals, our own unique gifts, it's okay. It's our strengths, our things like that. The teacher hat is on for the moment. I apologize. I like to ask questions to kind of get the gray cells working, as Poirot would say. What is our unique calling as a parish that builds on what we each have as a calling as individuals? And what I think we kind of came to in that process was a place of belonging, of consistency, of wide acceptance, appreciation for each person that's here. These are unique things because there are not very many places where you can truly find that sense of welcome. Last week, our question was, how do we marshal our resources? How do we creatively steward our resources towards shaping a church where that calling is the focal point? The idea that we can be stewards of St. Anne's, but it makes a lot more sense if we think of stewardship of our resources, not only for St. Anne's itself, but for what St. Anne's is called to. Does that make sense? And that's a hard question to answer because it takes this abstract concept that we've been exploring of what makes us come alive and go do it, and trying to figure out ways to think proactively about how we can really kind of put in place systems that prioritize how we steward our resources toward not just the existence of St. Anne's, but the calling of St. Anne's. And that's where this week we'll pick up with the final of the major questions, is how do we move from the little church that could to the little church that does? Now, I take great pride in the fact that we have continued to be the little church that could. I always remember that I think I can, that I recognized in myself when I was a kid, and always, was blown away by the little engine that could, because he just did it. He didn't wonder if he could, he just did it. And that's what you do. You make things work. You make it happen in spite of all the challenges. In spite of your rector going down with a fever and having to pivot at the last second. Little things. I want to explore the differences today of what it would look like with the goal of our purpose, of our calling in mind, to move, to build on the little church that could, to become the little church that does. So, the little church that could is the church that survives. You survive. That's a great thing. I mean, one of the best, songs from disco, I will survive! You get there, you make it work. and it stays afloat in spite of difficulties. That's a rare gift among parishes. I've heard of so many stories of people in our position that have not survived the way that you have. It's a wonderful thing. The church that could is the church that has successful programming and butts and pews, to put it crudely. The idea that we have successful programs like children's ministries, service projects, good liturgy, forums, things along those lines, and that we have people coming into the church. It's a very standard model of church that we've grown up with. Then the church that balances its budget for the sake of paying the bills. Kind of important. And that is a gift of gratitude and something that we have to be able to do. It's really hard to function if you can't pay the bills. And the church that does some work in the world, but is not actively outward looking. And that's not a bad thing. But it's a church that has a few things here and there because we have limited resources. But particularly after the pandemic just put a kibosh on everything, it's been harder to be able to be outward looking. And most churches in the denomination tend to be along those lines of a few set projects out in the world, but it's predominantly focused on Sunday morning service and Sunday morning life and things that are internal to the church. That's the church that could. Today I want to explore trying on for size. It's like going to the retail store and trying on a few different outfits to see how this fits, how it feels to us, of an image of what the church that does can look like, here especially. It's the church that doesn't survive, but it thrives. It knows its purpose and strives toward that purpose with trust and faithing with God. It's the church that knows where it's going, relies on God. It's the church that gets up that hill because it knows that God will give it the grace that it needs to get there. But not only getting over the hill, but why are we even going over the hill in the first place? The church that tailors its programming toward fulfilling that purpose. It's one thing to have the standard program that churches have, and that's a good thing. But what is the end goal? What is the real purpose behind it? What are we having these programs for? All of these things need to be considered through the lens of what is our purpose? What is our calling? What is it that makes us come alive? The church that balances its budget to be able to prioritize resources toward that purpose. That was another piece that came up for me when I was planning this stewardship campaign, was, like I said, at the church in Georgia where my parents go, where they canceled an $8 million deficit. $8 million. Because they wanted to prioritize money towards their ministry, not thinking about the budget. And that's not an easy thing to do. And they have a lot more resources than we do, in fairness. But I feel like if they can pull that off with a several hundred person congregation, what might we be able to do as we continue to think creatively about how to do that? And that is an ongoing conversation. The church that expects to meet the outside world, not only in programs, but in worship, in outreach, in ministry, in relationships. Where we don't hope to experience the outside world, we expect it. Whether it's here on Sunday mornings, out on the street, in programs we're involved with, in our daily lives, sharing our story of our life with God. And most of all, the church that cannot help but grow because its purpose drives it toward meeting the world's needs, because it is alive and thriving with purpose. We're the little church that gets over that hill. We are the engine that could. The church that thinks it can doesn't know if it's going to make it over that hill. The church that does not only gets over that hill, it knows why it's going in the first place. It knows its purpose. It knows where its resources are, and that is why it makes it. And it goes there and it meets that purpose. And that is what I want to see us really explore more in depth. This may be a very new way of looking at things. It may not. I don't know for sure. But I feel like as we continue to explore, not just during stewardship campaign, but throughout our time together, where God is calling us in our ministry, driving us towards our purpose, everything that we do in stewardship, whether it be pledging, whether it be volunteering, whether it be leading things, whether it be showing up for things, everything we do is geared towards that calling and that purpose and the unique offerings that we have that make us come alive, that the community around us needs desperately. Now, if that feels overwhelming, that's where grace comes in. That's where we go, okay, I know that we can't do this on our own. I'm going to do a cheesy trust fall into the arms of God and let God lead me into that unknown, into that new possibility, into that sense of discernment. Discernment is an ongoing process. There's a reason why it takes 5 or 6 years to get ordained. It's not an overnight thing. But to really kind of dive in deep with what is our calling. We are still here for a reason. We are still strong for a reason. We are a great place to be for a reason. So as we continue to think about stewardship, and as we begin our conversation today in small groups, but I want us to think about today, after all the conversations that we've had, remembering what makes you come alive and go do it. What makes you come alive? What makes you just enthusiastic? And then what do you perceive is what makes St. Anne's come alive? And then how do we think about the purpose that we're driving towards, and how do we figure out how to steward our resources in that direction? And shift from a church that is modeled on the traditional model of church of we do these things to perpetuate the congregation, to we do these things to live into the calling that we have been called.